The Marshal ordered her whipped. The next day, his wife knelt at her door. The smell of dust and shame hung thick in the plaza as Nora Ashcroft stood against the post, her wrists bound with hemp rope that bit into her skin. 16 strokes. That was the sentence Marshal Huxley Brennan had pronounced from his oak desk that morning, his voice carrying the weight of law across the small adobe courthouse. The crowd gathered in Cimarron Springs, New Mexico territory. Hadn't come for justice. They'd come for spectacle. Nora's back remained straight, even as Deputy Amos Rigby pulled back his arm, leather whip coiled like a serpent. She'd been accused of theft by the Marshal's own household, though her hands had never taken what wasn't freely given. But truth, she'd learned, was a luxury the powerless couldn't afford. As the first crack split the September air, Nora Ashcroft made herself a promise. She wouldn't cry out, and she would not forget. 3 days earlier, Nora had walked through the carved wooden doors of the Brennan residence, carrying fresh linen and a basket of mending. She'd worked as a seamstress for 6 families in town, her needle steady and her prices fair. Mrs. Lillian Brennan had hired her a month back to alter curtains and repair the Marshal's dress shirts. Fine work that paid better than most. The house stood apart from the dusty street. 2 stories of whitewashed adobe with glass windows, shipped all the way from St. Louis. Inside, it smelled of lemon oil and beeswax, the kind of clean that came from hired help and careful living. Miss Ashcroft, Lillian Brennan, appeared in the parlor doorway, her dress a deep emerald that matched nothing in the austere desert landscape. She was younger than Nora by perhaps 5 years, 23 at most, with auburn hair pinned in elaborate twists that spoke of Eastern finishing schools. "I need those curtains finished by Thursday. We're hosting the territorial judge." "Yes, Mom, I'll have them ready." Nora spread the fabric across the settee, measuring twice before marking her cuts. Lillian hovered, fingers worrying the cameo at her throat. "My husband says you live alone, out past the Acequia." "Near it, yes. Small place, but it's mine." Nora kept her eyes on her work, uncomfortable with the attention. Conversations with wealthy women rarely led anywhere good. Isn't that dangerous? A woman alone? "I manage." The truth was simpler and harder than that. Nora had come west after burying her father in Kansas, following rumors of work in the mining camps. When the silver veins played out, she'd stayed, learning that a woman with a trade could carve out something resembling independence if she didn't mind the whispers. She finished measuring and gathered her tools. "I'll return Thursday morning." Lillian nodded, but her expression remained troubled, as if she wanted to say more. Instead, she walked Nora to the door, watching from the porch as the seamstress made her way down the dusty street toward the Mercantile. Nora didn't see Lillian's pearl brooch until it caught the light in her basket that evening, nestled among the thread spools like an accusation made flesh. Marshal Huxley Brennan kept his office like he kept his town, organized, unforgiving, and cold. When Deputy Rigby dragged Nora through the door at dawn, her protests falling on deaf ears, the Marshal barely looked up from his paperwork. "Empty the basket." Nora's hands shook as she upended the contents onto his desk. Thread spools rolled across the scarred wood, scissors clattered, and there, gleaming among the mundane tools of her trade, lay Lillian Brennan's brooch, pearls, and silver filigree worth more than Nora earned in 6 months. "I didn't take it." Her voice came out steadier than she felt. "Someone placed it there." "My wife is missing that exact piece. She discovered it gone yesterday evening. Huxley finally raised his eyes, and Nora saw no curiosity there, no question. He'd already decided. You were the last person in our home. I'm being framed. By whom? His tone suggested the answer was too absurd to entertain. My wife? Deputy Rigby? Or perhaps I planted evidence against a seamstress for sport. The logic trapped her like barbed wire. She had no proof, no witness, no defense beyond her word against a Marshal's household. In Cimarron Springs, that arithmetic always came up wanting. 16 lashes in the plaza, tomorrow at noon. Huxley returned to his papers, dismissing her with bureaucratic efficiency. Be grateful I don't send you to the territorial prison. Please. Nora started forward, but Rigby's hand clamped on her shoulder. Marshal's been generous, the deputy muttered, steering her toward the cell. Most places would have given you 25 and a brand. The iron door slammed shut with the finality of a coffin lid. Through the small barred window, Nora could see the plaza, where she'd be made example of, where her name would become synonymous with thief, where the thin protection of reputation she'd built would burn away like morning frost. She sat on the narrow cot and finally let herself shake. Noon's sun beat down merciless as they led her out. Someone had hammered a post into the plaza's center overnight, fresh wood still bleeding sap. The crowd gathered thick, miners with dirt under their nails, merchants closing shop for the spectacle, women with hard faces who saw in Nora's punishment a confirmation of what they'd always suspected about women who lived alone. Deputy Rigby tied her wrists to iron rings, efficient and impersonal. 16, he said, loud enough for witnesses to hear. By order of Marshal Brennan for theft. Nora pressed her forehead against the wood and made herself empty. She'd survived worse. Her father's death, the long journey west, a winter when she'd eaten nothing but cornmeal for 6 weeks. Pain was temporary. Shame was something you either carried or refused. She chose refusal. The first stroke came with a sound like tearing canvas, pain blooming across her shoulders in a red wash. Nora bit the inside of her cheek and counted. 1, 2. The crowd's murmur rose and fell like tide. 3, 4. Someone laughed, high and nervous, immediately shushed. 5, 6. Halfway through, her vision swam. She focused on small things. The smell of pinon smoke from a nearby chimney, a child crying in the distance, the way sunlight caught in the adobe walls, turning them gold. 7, 8, 9. Her back was a map of fire now, each nerve screaming, but she didn't scream. Wouldn't give them that. 10, 11, 12. Through the haze, she glimpsed Lillian Brennan, watching from the courthouse steps, one hand clutched to her mouth, face pale as milk. Their eyes met for a heartbeat before Lillian turned away, disappearing into the building's shadow. 13, 14, 15. The final stroke fell harder than the rest, Deputy Rigby putting his full weight behind it as if to seal the punishment. 16. Silence dropped over the plaza like a blanket. Someone coughed. Boots scraped on packed earth. Then gradually the crowd dispersed, satisfied or ashamed or simply ready for supper. Rigby cut her loose. Get yourself tended, he said, almost gentle. Doc Weston's is 2 streets over. Nora's legs nearly buckled, but she locked her knees and walked. Didn't run, didn't stumble. Away from that post and those witnesses. She walked until the plaza disappeared behind her, until the last murmurs faded, until she reached her small house by the Essequia, where the water ran cool and indifferent to human cruelty. Only then did she let herself collapse. Doc Ezra Weston found her the next morning, drawn by a neighbor's concern. He was a weathered man in his 60s who'd seen the elephant in the war between the states and had little patience for territorial nonsense. Christ's sake, girl. He knelt beside where Nora had managed to drag herself half onto her bed, back still seeping through her torn shirt. You should have come to me yesterday. Couldn't walk that far. Her voice came out cracked, throat raw from trying not to scream. Weston worked in silence, cleaning the wounds with carbolic solution that burned worse than the whip had. Nora gripped the bed frame and endured. When he finally bandaged her, wrapping clean cotton around her ribs and shoulders, she felt like a corpse prepared for burial. What did they get you for? Theft. I didn't commit. Never do you? But his tone held no judgment. Stay still for 3 days minimum. Keep the bandages dry. If you see red streaks or feel fever, you come find me immediately. Can't pay you today. Didn't ask you to. Weston packed his supplies with practiced efficiency. Someone ought to ask Marshal Brennan why he's so quick with the lash for a woman who's never caused trouble. But that's politics, and I'm too old for politics. After he left, Nora lay still and stared at the figures crossing her ceiling. The pain had settled into a dull roar, almost bearable. What wasn't bearable was knowing she'd have to leave Cimarron Springs now. Her reputation was ruined, her body marked, her name poison. She'd have to start over somewhere else. Albuquerque maybe, or Santa Fe where no one knew her story. The thought exhausted her more than the wounds. She was drifting toward uneasy sleep when she heard footsteps outside. Then a knock, soft but insistent. Nora closed her eyes, hoping whoever it was would assume she'd gone. But the knock came again. Miss Ashcroft? Please, I need to speak with you. Lillian Brennan's voice, unmistakable. Nora's first instinct was to ignore her, to let the marshal's wife stand outside until shame or fear drove her away. But curiosity, and something harder, something that wanted to see if Lillian would actually kneel as guilt demanded, made her drag herself upright. It's open. Lillian Brennan stood in Nora's doorway, wearing a simple traveling dress, none of her usual finery. Her hair hung in a loose braid, and her face bore the unmistakable marks of crying. Red eyes, swollen nose, the blotchy skin that came from hours of weeping. May I come in? Nora leaned against the doorframe, every movement a negotiation with pain. Come to see your handiwork. Please, Lillian's voice broke. I need to tell you something. Need to... She looked behind her, nervous then back. May I? Against her better judgment, Nora stepped aside. Lillian entered the small room and stopped, taking in the sparse furniture, the carefully mended curtains, the life of someone who owned nothing they couldn't carry. Then she dropped to her knees. Miss Ashcroft, Her breath hitched. I put the brooch in your basket. I planted it. The theft, the accusation, all of it was a lie. For a moment, Nora couldn't speak. The confirmation of what she'd suspected felt less like vindication and more like a door closing on any remaining faith in human decency. Why? Lillian's hands twisted in her lap. My husband, Marshal Brennan, She swallowed hard. He's been visiting a woman named Iris Colton, who works at the Silver Bell. Everyone knows, but no one speaks of it, because he's the law here. I thought if I created a scandal, if you were arrested and I made a scene about the brooch, maybe he'd see... Her voice dissolved into tears. I thought he'd remember we have a marriage, that I exist. So you decided to destroy me instead. I didn't think... I thought it would just be jail time, maybe a fine. I didn't know he'd order the whipping. He's never been that harsh before. And yesterday, when I saw what I'd caused, what I'd done to you, Lillian looked up, tears streaming. I'm sorry. God help me. I'm so sorry. I went to him last night and confessed everything, told him you were innocent, that I'd lied. Nora's breath caught. What did he say? He called me hysterical, said I was inventing stories to cause him trouble. He threatened to send me back east to my father if I kept talking. Lillian's voice went flat, hopeless. No one will believe me, Miss Ashcroft. My word against his, and he's the Marshal. I'm just his foolish wife. The arithmetic of power, Nora thought bitterly. Different people, same mathematics. Why tell me this? Nora asked. What good does your confession do now? Lillian reached into her dress pocket and pulled out a leather money purse, heavy with coin. It's $300. Everything I brought to the marriage, everything I've saved from my household accounts. Take it. Leave this town. Start somewhere fresh, where his authority doesn't reach. Nora stared at the purse. $300 was a fortune. Enough to establish herself in a real city, buy proper equipment, maybe even open a small shop. It was more money than she'd ever held at once. It was also admission that justice would never come. I don't want your guilt money. Please. Lillian's composure cracked completely. You can't stay here. He'll make your life unbearable. Everyone believes you're a thief now. This is the only way the only thing I can. She dissolved into sobs. Nora looked down at the woman kneeling on her floor and felt something unexpected. Pity. Lillian was a victim too, just wearing different chains. Both of them trapped by a man who believed his authority extended to cruelty, who wielded law and marriage like weapons. Get up, Nora said quietly. Get off your knees. Lillian looked up, hope flickering in her swollen eyes. I'll take your money, Nora continued. Not because you've earned forgiveness, but because you're right. I can't stay. But hear me clearly, Mrs. Brennan. Your guilt doesn't purchase absolution. You don't get to feel better because you confessed. You have to live knowing what you did, same as I have to live with these scars. Lillian nodded, fumbling the purse onto Nora's small table. I understand. Do you? Nora's voice hardened. Your husband visits Iris Colton because he's cruel and faithless. You hurt me because you were desperate and selfish. Neither of you saw me as human, just a tool for your marriage theater. You want to make this right? Actually stand up to him. Tell the truth publicly, even if no one believes you. Be uncomfortable for once in your protected life. He'll send me away. Then you'll survive away. Nora moved carefully to the table and picked up the purse, its weight solid and real. I did. Lillian rose unsteady. She looked smaller than before, diminished somehow. Where will you go? Somewhere without marshals. Nora opened the door, a clear dismissal. Goodbye, Mrs. Brennan. I hope your conscience troubles you for a good long while. After Lillian left, Nora stood in her doorway and watched the sun paint the Sangre de Cristo mountains, amber and rose. The money in her hand felt like both ending and beginning. Proof that sometimes grace wasn't about forgiveness, but about taking what you needed and building something new from rubble. She'd leave Cimarron Springs before the week ended. But first, she had one more piece of business to attend to. Friday evening found Nora in Doc Weston's office, back freshly bandaged and her travel bag packed. The old doctor had agreed to her plan with only one raised eyebrow and a grunt of approval. You sure about this, girl? Never been more certain of anything. Saturday morning, Nora walked into the office of the Cimarron Clarion, the town's weekly newspaper, run by a sharp-eyed widow named Hazel McIntyre, who'd made her living chronicling territorial politics without fear or apology. "Miss Ashcroft." Hazel looked up from her typesetting, taking in Nora's careful movements and the set of her jaw. "I heard about your troubles. 16 strokes seems excessive for a first offense." It was false charges. Nora set Lillian's written confession on the desk, extracted that morning at Nora's demand, witnessed by Doc Weston. "Mrs. Lillian Brennan planted stolen property in my basket to create scandal. Here's her sworn statement admitting guilt, along with Dr. Weston's testimony regarding my injuries." Hazel picked up the papers, reading quickly. Her expression shifted from skepticism to outrage. Christ, this is explosive. If I run this, Marshal Brennan will make trouble." "Then let him try." Nora leaned against the desk, back screaming but voice steady. "I'm leaving town today. You print truth or don't. That's your choice. But I want people to know what happened, want it in writing, so the next woman he decides to make example of has a record to point to." Hazel studied her for a long moment, then nodded slowly. "Next edition runs Wednesday. I'll put it front page, full story. Where are you headed?" "Denver. Figured a city that size could use another seamstress." "Denver's good. Got some friends there who run a boarding house on Larimer Street. I'll write you a letter of introduction." Hazel was already pulling out paper. "Women got to look out for each other, Miss Ashcroft. God knows the men won't do it." Nora left the newspaper office with a lighter step, despite her wounds. She collected her horse from the livery, a sturdy mare named Juniper she'd bought last spring, and loaded her few possessions into saddlebags. As she rode out of Cimarron Springs, headed north toward the high country, and then east to Denver, she passed the plaza where they'd whipped her. The post still stood, dark stain marking where her blood had soaked into wood. She didn't stop, didn't look back. Behind her, Lillian Brennan watched from her second-story window, one hand pressed against glass. In 3 days, she'd read her confession printed in the Clarion. In a week, territorial authorities would arrive with questions for Marshal Brennan. In a month, her father would recall her to Boston in disgrace. But that morning, as Nora Ashcroft rode toward a future unmarked by Cimarron Springs, Lillian simply watched the seamstress disappear into autumn light and wondered if courage was something you were born with or something circumstances beat into you. The answer, like most truths, lay somewhere between. Denver sprawled larger and louder than anything Nora had imagined, a chaos of mining fortune and railroad ambition, where buildings rose 5 stories high and electric streetlights were already being installed on main thoroughfares. Hazel's letter secured her a clean room at Mrs. Ruth Calloway's boarding house, and within 2 weeks, Nora had established herself in a small shop space on Blake Street. She hung no sign advertising her past, made no mention of New Mexico territory. When customers asked where she'd learned her trade, she said simply, "Kansas," and changed the subject to their needs, alterations, new dresses, mending that required patient hands. The work came steady. Denver's growing population meant women needed seamstresses, and Nora's skill spoke for itself. She kept her prices fair and her deadlines honest, building reputation through craft rather than story. 6 months after leaving Cimarron Springs, she hired her first assistant, a young woman named Adelaide who'd arrived in Denver, fleeing an arranged marriage. Together, they managed the shop's growing business. Nora teaching Adelaide the finer points of tailoring, while Adelaide handled customers with easy charm. Sometimes at night, lying in her boarding house room, Nora's back would ache with phantom memory. The scars had healed into pale lines that she couldn't see but could always feel. A map written on her skin of power, cruelty, and survival. She never regretted taking Lillian's money. Guilt could purchase passage, but not redemption. That was something each woman had to earn through years of small, deliberate choices. Nora chose to build rather than brood, to create rather than carry hate. One spring morning, nearly a year after the whipping, Nora opened the shop to find a letter waiting under the door. The envelope bore no return address, but was postmarked Boston. Inside, in careful handwriting, "Miss Ashcroft, I read in the territorial papers that Marshal Brennan has been removed from his position pending investigation. His associate, Iris Colton, gave testimony regarding several abuses of power. I thought you would want to know. I am living now with my sister in Massachusetts. My marriage has been annulled. I work in a textile mill and am learning what honest wage means. I do not ask forgiveness, but I want you to know your courage, leaving, speaking truth, surviving, gave me permission to do the same. Yours in shared understanding." Lillian Nora read the letter twice, then carefully folded it and placed it in her desk drawer. She didn't respond. Some communications didn't require reply. They simply needed to exist. Acknowledgement of pain given and received. Roads diverged, but running parallel. Outside, Denver's streets bustled with commerce and ambition. Nora smoothed her apron, checked her supplies, and prepared for another day of careful work. Her hands, steady on fabric and thread, stitched small repairs into lasting strength. In the end, that was what mattered. Not the cruelty endured or the justice delayed, but the life built stitch by stitch, the grace of survival, the stubborn determination to be more than what violence had tried to make her. The shop bell chimed. A customer entered. Nora smiled and picked up her shears. "Good morning," she said. "How can I help you?" 3 years after Nora Ashcroft rode out of Chimaran Springs, the town's plaza stood quiet under October sun. The whipping post had been removed, torn down by new ordinance after a territorial investigation exposed systematic abuses under Huxley Brennan's authority. The former marshal had disappeared shortly before charges were filed. Some said he'd fled to Mexico. Others claimed he'd headed to California under a different name. No one knew for certain, and after initial interest faded, no one much cared to find out. The Brennan house was sold at auction. A merchant family from Santa Fe bought it and promptly painted the walls terracotta, erasing the austere whitewash. They filled it with children's laughter and the smell of chile roasting in autumn, human sounds that gradually overrode whatever ghosts of cruelty and shame had lingered in those rooms. In Denver, Nora's shop thrived. She'd moved to larger premises on Market Street and now employed 3 seamstresses. Her reputation for fair dealing and fine work brought customers from across the city, including mining magnates' wives and theater actresses, who appreciated her discretion. She never married, never sought it. Independence suited her better than any partnership she could imagine. But she built a community, women who worked together, looked out for each other, understood that survival often meant creating your own family from strangers who'd also learned to value freedom over safety. On quiet evenings, when the shop was closed and Denver's streets had emptied, Nora sometimes touched the scars on her back through her dress fabric. They were there, always would be, testament to cruelty, yes, but also to endurance. She'd survived what was meant to break her. She'd transformed shame into strength, powerlessness into agency. That, she thought, was its own kind of justice. Not the clean justice of courts and punishment, but the harder justice of outliving your own destruction, of building something good from the rubble of the worst thing that ever happened to you. The kind of justice you carried in your hands and your heart, and the life you stitched together, stitch by careful stitch, until the pattern finally made sense.